Now it's the time for me to introduce two of my colleagues, physiotherapists. So the first is Jan Horsley. Jan Horsley has been a physio for a long time. He has been a physiotherapist for England Rugby Union for 14 years and spent the last 9 years working with the elite playing squad as a physiotherapist to England A teams. Now currently is the athlete health lead upper limb for the UK Sports Institute in Wakefield, West Yorkshire. And yeah, he's a lecturer and he's a dear friend of mine, and he's very active also in EUSSER, the European Society of Shoulder and Elbow Rehabilitation, and yeah, happy to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you everybody for the invitation, and thank you for turning up at the end of two days. So the title of my talk is the collision shoulder, but as you will probably gather from what Suzanne just said, that it's going to be really biased to rugby, because for the best part of 30 years I've been involved with managing rugby players. So hopefully. So if we look at the incidence of shoulder injuries in rugby, if we compare male side, so adolescents with seniors, there's about 12 to 13 injuries per 1,000 hours of rugby played. But what's more important now when we're looking at the data is we can see that it's more than double the incidence in female rugby. Now, it's in the UK, we've got a fully professional league for females playing rugby union. And so this is an area that we're starting to look at, and I've got a PhD student who's starting to do some work looking at shoulder injuries within female rugby players. So if we then start to think about, so what is happening? Why are our rugby players getting injured? Well, we see that it's about 20% of the injuries that rugby players get, second or just to knee injuries really. But what we do know, and this has been agreed on for many years, it's the tackle situation where most of the injuries will occur anywhere, but certainly it's where a high proportion of the shoulder injuries occur. And then another factor that we need to take into consideration is there's a high recurrence rate. So there can have an extended time period out, so up to 3 days, which in a professional team is not a good thing to have. And to be fair, 20 years ago, that stat that our shoulder injuries had a high recurrence rate in professional rugby was the thing that sent me on my journey for my PhD, looking at trying to find out some of the causes of shoulder injuries in rugby. So you get the idea. So when we look at what's happening in that contact situation from there, we can see that typical forces range to sort of between 200 and 400 kilograms. Now that was instrumented by having sensor pads on their shoulders when players were tackling. But if we want to look at it another way, we can look at the acceleration, the multiple accelerations of gravity. So the average G-force in a tackle in a professional game is be 21 to 22 G, so 21 to 22 times gravity acceleration. The highest recorded one is 200 G from there. So these forces are huge that these shoulders are taking. And again, out of the data that's on there, what's interesting to me and was and still is interesting to me is the shoulder shear force. So that humeral head on the glenoid, the amount of force that it takes. Now, we have a standard tackle, which, as you saw in the video, they're all very similar. In a moment, we'll talk about some other types of landing on the shoulder. But yeah, so that shear force is important per tackle on there. So just to try and put things into perspective. So a couple of years ago, as a marketing feat, Red Bull Racing got their F1 car and they took it to their British champions, which were Bath Rugby Club. And they set their scrum down, so that's 8 men against their Formula 1 car, and to see who was the strongest. So we can see there that man versus machine, man won there. So about the total weight of the pack of those 8 players was nearly 900 kilograms, and it pushed an F1 car back nearly a metre. So again, these are powerful individuals, okay, producing large levels of force. Now, if we look at the total team collision impact that goes through the shoulders in a team in a standard game, then that equates to enough force to lift an adult male rhino. So adult male rhinos weigh between 2,000 and 3,000 kilograms. So again, a phenomenal feat. Or if we look at it another way, the force that is produced in a scrum, like we've just seen there, is the equivalent of being hit by a car at 30 miles an hour. And there's an average of 15 to 19 scrums a game. So if you think about just crossing the road and being hit by a car 20 times, and each time getting up and trying to cross the road again. So the other contacts that we have, apart from the tackle, that make up the collisions, we've got the scrums that I've spoken about, and then we have these things. So they're sort of top right is a maul where people stand up and sort of grab a hold of each other and stay on their feet, and then when they go to ground and it looks like a big pile up and nobody knows what they're doing, that is called a ruck. So all those are contact areas within the game. So an average game will have, across both teams, so there's 15 players on each side in professional rugby union, so we'll have about 270 tackles. But those tackles vary where the player positions are. So if we look at this graph here, we can see that the people who do most tackling are the open side flanker and the blind side flanker. I'll show you the positions in a minute, followed by the hooker. Okay, so we can see here, so at the back of the scrum, so you have 3 people at the front, that's called the front row, 2 in the middle, the second rows, and then you've got 6, 7, and 8 around the back. So 6 and 7 are the flankers, and number 2 is the hooker. So they're the ones who do most of the heavy lifting during the game, tackling the oncoming opponent. So then if we start to work out a little bit of the maths, so the average number from that table there of tackles across a team is about 9. Okay, so 9 tackles, 400 kilograms per tackle, which means that at the end of a game, a shoulder will have experienced 3,600 kilograms of force. Now, these are big numbers, okay? And these are players who play week in and week out, generally with a low incidence of injury within the shoulder. So if you try and think a little bit about the rugby shoulder, so part of my PhD, we were trying to look how we can understand what happens in the rugby shoulder a little bit more. So one of the early studies that we did, we thought we'd have a look at their proprioception, so we'd look at their joint position sense. So we took 3 cohorts. We had a group of professional rugby players who had previously had a shoulder injury that had kept them out of the game for a significant amount of time and be rehabbed, and for the last 6 months had no injury with the shoulder. So that's the first 2 groups. So that's comparing the injured shoulder and the non-injured shoulder. Then our second cohort were professional rugby players who had never experienced a shoulder injury that kept them out of training or match play for any length of time. And then our third group was our age match controls. And what we can see there, for a start, that if you look at that, training for rugby, okay, probably gives you better joint position sense there, because our uninjured rugby shoulders were better than our controls. And we looked at their joint position sense, excuse me. So we had them supine, blindfolded, started pointing up the ceiling, then we took them to what we called mid-range, which was 45 degrees of external rotation, kept them there for 5 seconds, brought them back to vertical, asked them to actively reproduce, so active joint reposition sense, and we measured the error either way. Now, what we didn't do in that study is measure whether they undershot, okay, or they overshot. So this is just the gross error from their target angle. And then we repeated that towards outer range. Again, we chose 80 degrees, did exactly the same, started here, blindfolded, took them to 80 degrees, kept them there 5 seconds, brought them back to vertical and asked them to reproduce that angle. And then what we can see there as well, that those players that had been back playing 6 months post-injury, who had not had any problems, still had joint position sense errors in mid-range, but more importantly, at outer range. We also did another study, because we know that tackling was a big area where we were getting lots of trauma and lots of injuries around the shoulder, we decided to try and have a look, amongst other things, is what happens to joint position sense in a healthy shoulder when you do a tackle. So we set up here, so a tackle bag with a player, 1 step and hit. So step and hit, did that 10 times. Before they did that, we did our tests again. We measured mid-range, joint position, reproduction acuity at 45 and at 80 degrees. And so what we can see here, when we look in the mid-range position, that between pre-tackling and post-tackling, there's very little change. Okay, there's a small increase in joint position error. But also what's important, if you compare the ranges in the mid-range and outer range, you can see that mid-range joint position sense was less reliable than outer range joint position sense, so being out in here. And that's important when we think of tackling. Tackling's around about here as the arm goes in. And then if we look after tackling, what we found is that in outer range there was a significant change in that joint position sense here. So we're in our unstable position of our shoulder joint from there, and after doing 10 tackles, we then start to lose our joint position sense and proprioceptive acuity. Okay, and that was one of the things from my PhD that we thought could be leading to this high recurrence rate of shoulder injuries in professional rugby. If we add that to what we saw about the shear force in the second slide from there, that shear force is going to be creating some stress on the mechanoreceptors in the labrum and in the capsule around the joint. And then we know that if we stress those, we get that deafferentation. Okay, that sort of switches off that proprioceptive process. So we're starting to sort of pick up a picture of what could be contributing to some of these injuries outside the massive forces that are going into the shoulder. So this is another study, not ours from there, but then it just tells you a little bit, if we start to look at the function of the internal and external rotators of the glenohumeral joint. So they're similar to us, okay, but they did five tackles. So they measured several things. So if we look at peak torque, for the external rotators, okay, after five tackles, and we can see there's a small decrease, okay, in external rotation peak torque. Also then, if we look at the time to peak torque, so how quickly they get to their maximum force, there's a significant delay. So we're already starting to see something. So one of our studies that we did, we looked at doing an EMG around the shoulder, and what we could see is at a set period just before impact, the muscles that we did EMG on activated before contact. And in our cohort, we were lucky enough, not for the players. We had 4 players who returned outlying responses, who subsequently we found had slap lesions in their shoulder, so their onset of their muscles around the shoulder prior to contact were delayed. Then if we then start to look at our internal rotators, okay, we can see that after 5 tackles, actually, there's about a 20% increase in the force production of the internal rotators. But again, there is a delay, okay, to get into that force. But it's less of a delay than the medial rotators. So if we think about the force couple around the shoulder, the anterior-posterior cuff, they're the external rotator versus the internal rotators of the cuff there, we can start to see that we're getting, after tackling, we're getting an increased imbalance between the anterior and posterior cuff, the internal and external rotators, and the time in which they reach peak force. That again, the anterior cuff is slower than the posterior cuff is slower than the anterior cuff. So again, that ability to keep that humeral head centered in the joint, okay, will be less, and then can create the possibility of all sorts of injury and ultimately possibly a dislocation. And then the final thing to think about, so this is only 5 tackles in this study here. We can see that the fatigue of the external rotators was about 40% after 5 tackles, whereas the fatigue of the internal rotators was negligible. So the more tackles you do, the greater this difference between the anterior and posterior cuff, and the more likelihood that we've got a destabilized ball in the socket. So lots of injuries that we can get around the shoulder, and that's just general from collision athletes. But Professor Len Funk, who's done a load of work around the shoulder in sport, and especially lots of work in rugby, looked in a little bit more detail and started to associate these injuries with different positions. So the try-scorer position, there we get slap, bank out and rotator cuff. So that is you basically almost like a foosh falling out onto an outstretched hand. We've got the tackler, which is basically what we've talked about today. That's falling on the point of your shoulder, and then there's falling on, with a flex arm on there, where your sort of elbow hits and your body drops relative to that. And they were able to sort of, if they found out the mechanism of injury, so a lot of our rugby club games are videoed, by looking at the injury, you could possibly predict what you might find surgically. So that's what happens if you play rugby. So prevention's better than cure, and it's one of the things that came out of the early part of the Berne Consensus Statement from 2022. So what we need to do, we need to build a normal shoulder first. Okay, that's the difficulty. We need to have a shoulder that functions at low level without any compensation. So we need to improve that dynamic joint stability, that beautiful, effortless movement that we get when we get moved above our head. It's important we get that 3-dimensional scapular control, especially that 60 degrees upward rotation, because the cuff muscles, which we've talked about there, attached to the scapula. If we haven't got a stable scapula, then the force that the cuff can produce is reduced. We need to look at the different aspects as well. For a split second at contact, we need that high isometric force around the shoulder. But in everything else, we need that dynamic control, that concentric and eccentric movement, okay, to change the position of the shoulder in space, and then get the timing right between the scapula and the humerus to, again, to have that beautiful, effortless movement. And then get the body used to the contact forces that come through the shoulder. So we can use this as some principles, but again, massively work on that low-level stuff. Now, with athletes, you find that the low-level, easy stuff, they're not interested in. If they're not sweating, if the veins are not bulging out, if their eyes are not coming out of their head, they don't think it's valuable. But getting this low-level stability and motor control is important. And then as you start to load with strength and speed, we should still have good mobility control, so that humeral head should stay in the center. And remember, we've got the kinetic control, so that sort of 50% of the force that producing your shoulder comes from sort of waist down, 30% from trunk, and only 20% around the shoulder girdle. So conditioning that whole chain, because if we're lacking in these other 2 parts, then we can get over recruitment in the girdle, and that can create some problems as well. So just a few things here. So there's a lot going on these slides. So again, so we're going to think about the scapular control, looking at different things that we can do. So we all know we can look at the scapula, and we can look at whether it's dyskinetic or not through different amounts of loading here. Now, the weird one in the middle is that ability to separate stability at one joint from mobility at another. So with Will here, yes, he's got a high isometric force. So Will weighs about 100 kilograms. So he's holding a handstand, his scapular in upward rotation, which they need to be, but he needs to be able to move his head. Will's, well, plays rugby, but it was actually boxing then. So that ability to still move your head, okay, while your arm's doing something else is important, that we're not just rigid, okay, like that, which will be more chance of getting injury. And similarly, from a rugby tackle point of view, it's getting the head in the wrong position as you make contact that can lead to serious neck injury. We can start to think of that dynamic rotator cuff stuff. So again, some low level stuff. So Beth in the middle, just doing some nice low level through range cuff control in a supported position. And what we've got in the top left up there, that's 1 metre of drain pipe with 2 litres of water in there. So that device is called a slosh pipe, weighs 3 kilograms, and we're doing an exercise that that rugby player is used to, not an exercise that I generally allow. But again, the challenge is it's a perturbation device. You can see how he's fighting as the water sloshes from side to side as he loses control. Then we can start to have a cognitive challenge as well. So here we've just got blaze pod, and at this point, all we get him to do is when one light hit it, but then you can make it an even more complex challenge in saying you only hit it when the red light comes on or when the blue light comes on. And then on this side here, what I'm working on there is a perturbation process to the joint. So we've got Beth doing an isometric abduction, and I'm doing a random perturbation to get a shear on a joint. And the research shows that shear, if you put shear on a joint, that gets the local stabilizer, so the cuff, to work in advance of the global stabilizer of the joint. And then finally, we've got loads of posterior cuff stuff, and there's a million things there. So we can see different things of increasing the loading through there, decreasing the loading down there. We've got some endurance, so that's off the Derby shoulder stability program. So a 1 kilogram weight, drop and catch 100 times. But then here we're looking at that stretch shortening cycle. So we've got a 1 kilogram ball that's been thrown at our athlete. She has to eccentrically slow it down and then concentrically throw it back. So a plyometric response by the athlete. It's also a good test of proprioception of the physio, because you've got to throw it in the right position. Last couple of bits, then we've got to think about what do we need to do, how can we break down the contact forces and the positions that they get into when we're going back. So this is part of a battery that I use in deciding whether my my rugby players are going back. And then finally, think about that kinetic chain. So I really like this. This is a tornado ball. So at the moment, Will's using his kinetic chain, but now he stops using his kinetic chain, tries to muscle it with his arms, and you can see he comes away from the wall, okay, and he loses that tension in there. And then here, again, we've got some rigidity through the trunk while we're moving around a fixed arm, so we can differentiate between those. So that would be our basic program. So close season, work on getting some sort of strength and load through there. And then, but the monitoring is important. So big things that I use to monitor all my shoulders are grip strength. So at 90-90, look at a 3-second grip. We've done a couple of bits of research that show that that's a good proxy measure for how the posterior cuff's going. And then the other thing is to look at the glenohumeral internal rotation deficit. And again, I'll bring up, because we're in over here in Switzerland, about the Bern consensus, which I was lucky to be involved in. These are the domains that we need to consider with all our athletes, including our rugby players, as we go back to sport. So thank you very much for your time.